In Screencast 4, I want to talk briefly to you about government failure in the sport market and how this leads on to an economic rationale for the voluntary sector. So by the end of this lecture then we'll have looked at the commercial motivations and the market system and the limitations with this. We'll now consider government failure and the limitations with this and how the voluntary sector therefore has a role. So we should have an overall picture of the structure and the motivations and the economic rationale for all three of our sectors, commercial, government and voluntary. So despite the fact that we've talked about market failure and government intervening in the market to ensure the optimal resource allocation and that benefits are distributed efficiently and equitably across all groups in society, there are arguments against government intervention. And really, I suppose, this comes down to the point at which the government oversteps its role and takes too great a control in the marketplace and in individuals' decisions and supplier decisions. And the first of these arguments is that if the government intervenes too much, we can have a nanny state. And the nanny state argument is that we are not treated as adults, that consumers are not treated as autonomous individuals and beings. We are told what to do, and particularly on the right of politics and free market libertarians, this is very much an anathema to them. Consumers need to make decisions and be aware of the consequences of their decisions and take responsibility for their decisions. And the government stepping in and telling people what to do, how to do it, where to do it, is an affront to these values. So also there's a kind of issue around nanny state and having decisions made on our behalf. And this means that we never take responsibility for our own actions. So clearly in the sport market, being told what to do and how to do it, there are some arguments that this goes against free choice, and it doesn't kind of create autonomous, responsible citizens and consumers who are resilient and able to stand on their own 2 feet. Another perhaps more kind of managerial and less kind of political philosophical argument. So the nanny state argument is a bit of a kind of political values philosophical argument. A more managerial argument is, or could be, that the absence of the profit motive in the public sector means that organisations can lack incentives or the motivation to try to create efficiency and innovation. And this is sometimes referred to as the dead hand of the state. So where the state intervenes, you don't have great service, you can have poor service. There's a stifling lack of innovation and responsiveness to the customer, and the decision-making process gets bogged down in red tape and slow decision-making. But really it's that it kills off innovation and the need to serve customer needs. So that, there are clear examples of where you can see this in kind of big bureaucracies, and where decisions seem to be kind of made in the interests of the bureaucrats within the system rather than on the behalf of customers. But I think it's also fair to point out, and I'll put my cards on the table here. My background is in public sector sport, working for local government. I would counter that large commercial organisations also exhibit similar limitations, although possibly coming from a different point of view. So the need to mercilessly pursue profits could motivate people into kind of practices which are adverse to the benefits of individuals, kind of ripping off, not giving complete information. So that can lead to inefficiency and consumers not being given the best information and being given the best options. So some easy examples of this are, trying to buy the cheapest train ticket. It's not easy to do that if you go to a ticket in the rail station, because they won't necessarily tell you the cheapest way. They'll just sell you the ticket that you ask for. Other examples of these, the profit motive, leading to commercial organisations acting in ways that don't serve the needs of individuals, is clearly the banking crisis. So, people taking on loans that they were never going to really be able to pay, to repay, and there being a default on those loans, the banking system being put in jeopardy. And what happened is that in the end, the government and governments globally had to bail out banking systems because they had acted irresponsibly and not efficiently and effectively and in the best needs of people and society as a whole. So for me, you have good private sector organisations and bad private sector organisations. There are good examples of government intervention and poor examples of government intervention. So as is often the way with these kind of philosophical points of view, the reality lies somewhere between them. And so hence the reason why we've got this mixed economy in the state and voluntary and commercial sectors, is because we need a bit of both. If we had a pure free market, we would just have commercial organisations and voluntary organisations. And if we had a purely nanny-state, state-controlled system, we would have government organisations with some voluntary organisations. So, and for me, clearly that wouldn't serve the needs of individuals or societies or meet all demands. So, a second argument against government against government intervention is that, one of the arguments for government intervention in the market is to make sure that benefits are shared equitably across society, geographically, across the country, across different social and ethnic groups, so that we don't have those who have the best access to resources taking up all demand and their needs being met. But if you can't afford to pay the market price, then your needs aren't met, and therefore the benefits of wider externalities aren't also accrued in society. So there is some kind of commentary in public sector sport provision that government intervention doesn't necessarily lead to a more efficient allocation of benefits. And there is evidence, if we look at participation and usage of public sector sports facilities, that it is actually the better off, so that the higher socio-economic groups who take advantage of subsidised cheap facilities. Yeah? So the subsidy is intended to attract people on lower incomes with less resources to take part in sport. But actually what happens is that we have more people who probably could afford to pay a higher price taking advantage of the subsidised service, so that the subsidy is not targeted as effectively as it could be. My counter to this, and coming from the public sector background that I have, I'm quite happy to say this. From my experience, this kind of difference in socioeconomic usage is far more pronounced in commercially operated facilities. So this slide I'm showing you now is from Mintel, and admittedly it's from 2003. It's before the really rapid growth in budget gyms, which made gym usage cheaper and more accessible. But if we look at this, we can see we have different socioeconomic groupings. Now, if you're not familiar with these groupings, AB are the higher managerial and generally senior managers and professional classes. C1 is the kind of junior managerial and senior clerical. C2 is junior clerical and skilled manual labour. D and E are semi-skilled and unskilled manual labour. So the people generally on the lowest incomes, because they can sell their skills in the labour market at a lower price. The dark bars are usage by the different social groups of public sector sports facilities. So we can see that, for example, the AB group has around 10% of the AB population making use of a commercial of a public sector facility. And we can see that it's slightly higher for C1. And then there is what's called a social gradient. So the proportion of people using sports facilities in local authorities actually decreases. But to counter the argument of this kind of, government failure and government intervention not being effective, the counter argument is that if we look at private sector facilities, this gradient, how steep this gradient is far steeper. And we can see that, AB people are far more likely to use private. And as we move down, particularly into kind of C1, C2, D and E, there is a higher proportion of people in these kind of lower. So these are kind of middle income, and the D and E are the kind of lowest income groups. But we can see this is a substantial difference, and actually people in lower income groups are far more likely to use public sector facilities than they are to use private sector facilities. So the argument against market failure here is quite clearly, if we took away public sector facilities, how many of these people would transfer to private sector facility usage, or would many of them just stop participating entirely, in which case the externalities, the wider benefits, would disappear to society. And it is, and there's lots of research around this, it is the social groups D and E who put the highest strain on health systems in the UK, because they have far greater incidences of ill health, illness, morbidity, that's to say disease, and mortality, that's to say earlier death rates. So I think it's important to just bear this in mind, because if we did close, or if the public sector provision wasn't there, what would the impact be in terms of the social return on investment in sport? We'd probably lose a lot of those benefits. So we've looked at government failure, and I think it is fair to say that there are instances of government failure, and it's just worth saying that I think that in the public sector, since the 1980s, we've had increasing pressure from government through various pieces of legislation to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of management in the public sector. And there's no doubt in my mind, and in evidence that is out there, that overall the performance and the efficiency of public sector sports facilities has improved significantly, and actually they do behave and have adopted a lot of the practices that you might see in the commercial sector. But I would argue still with a kind of, promoting benefits of exercise and activity to reinvest in their communities, and not to generate a profit, but to kind of continue to serve the broadest range of options that they possibly can. However, sorry, I've messed up slightly the slide progression there. But the voluntary sector in sports, having said that the public sector seeks to meet as wide a range of options as possible, there is a rationale for the voluntary sector, and this is made by an author called Wiesbrod, who is quoted fairly extensively in Grattan and Taylor's books, which are on your reading lists. And the voluntary sector has the same role, he sees it, as the government sector in providing collective goods which have external benefits. Yeah, so public collective goods, merit goods with external benefits. And he says that because of government failure and commercial sector failure, there is a need for a voluntary sector. And his argument is that because of the heterogeneous nature of demand, and particularly heterogeneous nature of sport demand, if we look at sports, many of these are extremely minority participation sports. Okay, so participation sports, if you look at the Active People survey data or the Active Lives survey, there are some sports such as going to the gym, running, cycling, swimming, which have, participation rates up into the low double figures. So I'm talking about, 13, 14, 12, 11, 10%. But participation has a very, very long tail. And by that, I mean that there are many, many sports with participation rates below 2% of the population, around 1% of the population, below 1% of the population. Now, because of the size of demand, it is very difficult for the commercial sector to actually make a profit through serving some of these very low participation sports. And in the public sector, there are limited resources in the public sector. So it is going to go for the big markets. Hence you see sports centres serving, principally swimming, going to the gym, some kind of fairly popular sports. And you see football pitches, etc., provided in the public sector. But more minority sports you don't see. So in this situation, what you see is the voluntary sector providing collective goods and organising to provide collective goods, where the commercial sector won't do it from a profit motive point of view, and the government sector won't do it from a kind of a scale point of view. They want to be able to make sure that they hit the big demands and their resources are limited. So what you have really is a gap-filling role of the voluntary sector. In a sense, not just a gap-filling role, it's more important than that. But in terms of an economic rationale, it does kind of plug in the gaps and fill the smaller market segments, the heterogeneous demand, the fragmented demand, that there is, in order to maximise benefits. So with the commercial, the government and the voluntary sector, with a healthy mixed economy, we have the best opportunity of maximising benefits and making sure that a range of providers are able to provide a wide range of benefits. So that's all I wanted to say today, and I've kind of finished there on a closing statement which kind of, I suppose celebrates the benefits of this mixed economy, which is vital, and the importance of having a vital, and by vital I mean energised, active, effective, productive, mixed economy, where we have a commercial sector which is thriving, where we have a government sector which is well funded, well managed and delivering collective goods and benefits, and where we have a voluntary sector which is supported well by volunteers, where its contribution is recognised by government and supported in the form of grant aid. And if we have this, then we're more likely to be able to maximise the externalities and the benefits that accrue through participation sport to wider society. So that's the end of this particular screencast. Thank you.